And he did so by pursuing something that I'm going to talk about called little p purpose. And he did so without knowing it. And my hope for you today is after listening to this talk, you'll be able to do this exact same thing. Chris was on the cusp of turning 12 years old when he made arguably the second most important decision of his life. He decided to run away from home. And I kind of say it's his home, but it wasn't really his home. You see, his parents died when he was 2 years old in a car accident, and he had bounced from foster home to foster home to foster home. But this last one was unbearable. So he ran away. And over the next year, he did anything he had to find shelter and food. He lied. He cheated. He stole. And he did a bunch of other things we're not going to talk about. On the cusp of turning 13, he probably made the most important decision of his life. And it was the decision not to kill himself. Because he either was going to take his life or he was going to. You see, there's nothing to fill that sentence. But the night before, he had slept on a park bench with another homeless person, and they had told him about a synagogue in a neighboring city, the city of Waukegan, 5 miles away. And there was this rabbi named Rabbi Simon who took in homeless kids and got them connected to social services and gave them a job and did all sorts of wonderful things. So on the cusp of his 13th birthday, he made that most important decision, not to kill himself, but to wake up the next day, walk in his holy shoes, not holy like religious, but holy like actual holes in them, and a few hours later found himself sitting in the pews of the synagogue, waiting for Rabbi Simon to come in and see him. Little did he know, Rabbi Simon was about to save his life. And you know why I know? Because 6 months earlier, I saved Rabbi Simon's life. And you know what? 60 years earlier, a man who none of us met pretty much saved all our lives. And he did so by pursuing something that I'm going to talk about called little p purpose. And he did so without knowing it. And my hope for you today is after listening to this talk, you'll be able to do this exact same thing. So how did I get here? My father died when I was 7 years old. He had a brain aneurysm. He died suddenly. None of us knew it was coming. My father was a doctor, an oncologist. He took care of people with cancer. And because I was 7 years old, like many 7-year-olds, I thought everything that happened in the world was because of me. I had that kind of childish lens. And so when my father died, I figured I somehow was responsible. I wasn't good enough. It was something I did wrong. And so, at the tender age of 7, I decided the way to right this wrong, to fix this horrible thing that happened to me, I was going to become a doctor too, and I would walk in his footsteps, and that would cosmically fix everything. My sole purpose in life as a little kid was to become a doctor. This purpose filled me. It got me through a learning disability where I couldn't read like my peers. It got me through a move when we moved between middle school and high school and I had no friends. It got me through college when all of my friends were out at University of Michigan football games and I was sitting in the law library studying. It took me through medical school and residency until finally I was the doctor I always dreamed of being. I was fulfilling my true purpose. And a few years into it, something kind of hit me. I didn't particularly like it. I started to burn out. I was spending all my time doing things I didn't enjoy. Yes, there were the moments when I was helping the patients, when I was rushing in and saving the day, but they were few and far between. It was much more I was being yelled at on a regular basis. I was trying to fit too many patients into too little time, and I was filling out paperwork all day. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I told myself, the answer is to make enough money so that you can stop working and never have to do this thing again that isn't serving you. And so that was my first inkling of financial independence. I didn't know the vocabulary. I didn't know how to do this, but I knew that was my goal. And then in 2014, something incredible happened. I was in my office and I got a phone call from this guy named Jim Dolly, the white coat investor. He had written a book about financial independence for physicians. And I was writing a blog at the time, a blog about medicine, what it felt like to be a doctor. And he wanted me to review his book for my blog. And so that's what I did. I read his book. I learned about financial independence. I knew exactly what it was. And really, by the end of that day, I realized that I was financially independent. I actually had enough money because my parents had modeled all sorts of great behavior. I owned real estate. I owned stocks. I saved more than 50% of what I earned. I did it just because my parents did it. I never really thought about it. And I was so excited for a moment. And then I had a panic attack. Because the truth was, being a doctor was the only purpose I understood. It was the only identity that I knew. And that started an episode of depression in my life that lasted about 6 months to a year. I couldn't leave medicine. I was paralyzed. This thing that wasn't serving me, but that was burning me out. But if I left it, what could happen then? And so slowly, I learned how not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I used what I call the art of subtraction. I started taking away things in my work life I didn't like because I didn't need the money. So forget the practice, forget being on call, forget all these things I didn't like. And eventually, after years, I narrowed it down to doing hospice and palliative care work, working with the dying. This was something I would do even if I wasn't being paid for it. And so I knew I was getting rid of this identity, this purpose of being a doctor, but this was something that still felt important and significant, so I held on to that. But what was really as exciting is that really created space in my life. All of a sudden, I was working 10 hours a week. I wasn't up at nights. I wasn't up during the weekends doing work that I had to in the hospital. So all of a sudden, I could start thinking about the kind of person I wanted to be and how I wanted to fill this precious time, this thing that passes no matter what we do. And I realized that I always knew what I wanted to do. I loved writing. I loved public speaking. I loved having these deep, important conversations and telling stories. And I'd kind of been doing it my whole life, but I'd always been pushing it off to the side. I'll do it during lunch hour when I'm not seeing patients. I'll do it at night when the kids are asleep. This is not something you do for a living. This is a hobby. This is an indulgence. Well, all of a sudden I had time to do those things. And because I was really interested in personal finance, I started a personal finance blog, the one Stephen talked about, diversify.com. That eventually turned into a podcast. Meantime, I was still doing my hospice work. And during my podcast, I would be interviewing business people and financial independence people and authors and all these impressive people. And we talk about the money and they tell me how you create the money and how you build the money and how the money invests. And then we'd say, and what is it all for and what makes you happy? And there'd be this long pause. Some people knew, but a lot of people didn't. What is enough? Well, I have 10,000 units. Now I want 20,000 units. And here's where the magic happened. I realized that simultaneously I was seeing my dying patients at their bedside, and they were providing answers to these questions that all the financial people couldn't be. What is enough? What do I regret? Now that I'm dying and I can see that my life is finite, what should I have spent more time doing? And that epiphany led me to write a book called Taking Stock. What the dying have taught me about money and life. And really, this book is built on 3 premises. The first premise, we need to do a better job first defining our sense of purpose, identity, and connections. All right, what's purpose? We're going to talk more about purpose in a moment, but the idea was with my dying patients, we did something called a life review. We would ask them all sorts of questions. What were your most important moments? What were your scary moments? What are you most proud of? What were those key relationships in your life? And most importantly, what do you regret? And this became a template for talking to people about purpose. If you found out you were going to die tomorrow, what do you regret never having the energy, courage, or time to do? And for God's sake, you're not dying. What's stopping you? So that was purpose. Identity. My favorite exercise when it comes to identity is to ask yourself or say the statement, I am, and then answer the question. First time I did this, I said, I am. And of course, the first thing that came out is, I am a doctor. It's my profession, but it's not who I am. And then I went further and further. I am a father, a husband, a son. Also very true, but those are kind of definitional. Eventually, I started realizing that what I truly am is a communicator, an author, a podcaster, a public speaker. And this fit me better. And so purpose and identity, where it was really lacking in my life, was that third piece, connections. And you know why? Because I was walking around with this identity and purpose of being a doctor that didn't fit me. It didn't fill my soul. So I'd hang out with doctors sometimes for years, people I knew since medical school. Guess what? I didn't bond with them. But when I realized that my real purpose and identity laid in this idea of becoming a communicator, and I went to personal finance conferences like this, I started talking to people and felt more connected to them within minutes than people I had known for years. When you get purpose and identity right, the connections follow. So that was premise one of the book, Taking Stock. Define your sense of purpose, identity, and connections. The second premise is then build a financial life around them. And if you guys have heard me talk before, you've heard me talk about the 3 paths to financial independence. I call it the path of the 3 brothers. And it's a whole parable, and we're not going to go through the whole thing today, but this idea that path 1 is the person who doesn't really like the path. And so they run as fast as they can, and they don't sleep, and they don't eat, and they grind it out, and they get done as fast as possible. And maybe they're a little tired, but they have tons of freedom. And then you've got the middle brother who really wants to be as fast as the eldest brother, but they get too tired. So they take sabbaticals, they take time off, and then eventually come back. And it takes them a little longer to get to their end of the path. They don't have as much freedom and time as the first brother, but hey, they've got more energy. And finally, you have the last brother, the one that surprises everyone, who goes down that path intentionally, thoughtfully, and slowly, enjoying every minute of it. And when they get to the end of the road, they do something no one ever expects. They turn around and walk back the way they came. And so this is a parable, but we're really talking about the different ways to financial independence. We all know the path of the eldest brother. The first path is grinding it out, front-loading the sacrifice, doing a job you don't like, making as much money as possible, and then retiring with the net worth that allows you to then pursue purpose, identity, and connections. The path of the middle brother is a path a lot of us are interested in, passive income and side hustles, right? So you work really hard for a few years, you develop this passive income or side hustle that then creates money for you. And yes, you have to maintain your passive income and side hustle. So it's not like you retire completely, but you have a lot more time to pursue the things you like doing. And hey, if your passive income and side hustles also are a passion project, you're even better off. And then last but not least, the third path to financial independence, maybe the rarest, but also the fastest, is if you love what you're doing for a living, if you would do it even if you weren't being paid for it, guess what? You're kind of financially independent the moment you can get a job that supports your monthly needs. Yes, you're going to have to protect yourself. You're going to have to save a little for retirement because you can't work until you're 100, or most people can't. But generally, you can get there fast. I don't care what path you take, but the idea is once you understand premise 1, purpose, identity, and connections, you can then build premise 2, your financial path, around that to live the life that gives you the maximal freedom and allows you to do what you want to do, which brings us finally to the third premise. What scares you most? See, the problem is, even if you know your sense of purpose, even if you know your path to financial independence, you still have to ask the question and answer it. How do I know what to spend today? Do I spend money on things that are important to me? YOLO, you only live once. Even if it's important to me, but I also have to think about deferring gratification. I don't want to run out of money. So how do you decide whether to spend today or save for tomorrow? And so there's an important question I think we should all ask ourselves is, what scares you more? Are you scared that you're going to die young and never get to use that money for enjoyment and pleasure? Are you more afraid that you're going to live to a ripe old age and run out of money? Answering that question can help you look at that continuum of YOLO versus deferred gratification and help you decide at least a little bit of how much to spend today. So I wrote this book. I talked about those 3 premises, and I went to places like CampFI and gave a talk very similar to this. But I got a response I never expected. You see, every once in a while, someone would come up to me and they'd be angry. They'd be kind of sweaty and worked up. And they would look at me and they'd say, "Doc, you keep telling me to find my purpose, and I've been trying forever, and I can't find my purpose, and it's making me anxious. And will you please stop telling me to find my purpose?" Now, like the first time I heard that, I was like, okay, there's one occasionally. But then it happened over and over and over again. So it got me thinking, and I went to the literature. I'm like, well, is purpose important or is it not important? And the literature is totally clear. Studies show that having a sense of purpose in life is associated with health, longevity, and happiness. So much data. It's pretty clear. On the other hand, other studies show that up to 91% of people have something called purpose anxiety. The idea of purpose actually makes them anxious and depressed. So how could this be? How could purpose be the most important thing in our lives as well as a major cause of frustration? It's a paradox, the purpose paradox. And so after thinking about this a lot, after writing a book about purpose, spending lots of time with dying patients, having a mastermind, doing a podcast, doing coaching, after doing all this, it became fairly obvious to me is that we're looking at purpose all wrong. In fact, there probably is not just one purpose, but multiple versions of purpose, and at least two important ones, one of which gives you all those good things, and another which leads to frustration, anxiety, and depression. So let's talk about these versions of purpose. Basically, I define two different versions of purpose. One is what I call big P purpose, and another is what I call little p purpose. So let's talk about big P purpose, the one that I think is really more associated with depression and anxiety. Big P purpose is goal-oriented purpose. It is big by nature. Let's think of becoming the president, traveling to Mars, getting into the major leagues, and becoming, an RBI leader or home run leader. Those things are exceedingly hard. They are scarcity mindset oriented. Why scarcity? People think that's abundance, but it's actually scarcity because only a few people can do that and everyone else will fail. They are very easy to fail, and they are all or nothing. Either you get there and you make it to the major leagues, or you don't. I think this causes a lot of people to be frustrated. Now let's talk about the other kind of purpose, what I call little p purpose. Little p purpose is not goal-oriented at all. It is process-oriented. It's doing things we love the process of doing, regardless of whether we reach a goal or not. Goals aren't bad. I just think we should be more goal agnostic. Whether you reach the goal or not is not important. It's whether you enjoyed the process of getting there. These are very abundance mindset oriented. I could enjoy a million different things. I could have one purpose or many purposes. I could have a purpose that lasts 3 weeks or one that lasts my whole life. This is not all or nothing. It's all or all. But that still doesn't answer the question. Great, big P purpose, little p purpose, this sounds wonderful. But that person at CampFI who confronted me and said, I can't find my purpose, that question still is out there. So we're getting purpose wrong, but how do we find it? So my first answer to that question is you don't find purpose, you create it. But that person was right in the sense that we have to have these inklings or these beckonings, these callings that we can then build or create purpose around. I call these purpose anchors. So a lot of people ask me, well, how do I find my purpose anchors? And I actually say it's a lot easier than you think. Most people actually know it's purposeful for them. They're just too afraid to talk about it. So what are some easy ways? Well, the first is what I talked about in my first book, the life review. If you do a life review, and specifically, if you ask yourself the question, if I were to find out that I'm going to die tomorrow, what would I regret never having the energy, courage, or time to do? Guess what? Regret in someone who's about to die where they don't have agency to change their life is disappointment. But regret in a young person who has decades left, well, geez, that's purpose. So doing the life review is a really good way to start thinking about purpose. But there's so many other ways. I tell people, look at your job. How many people hate their jobs? Lots of people hate their jobs. But most people will tell you that there's something they like doing. There's one activity that they actually wake up invigorated to come to work for, or there's one person they really like working with, or there's one part of the job that you could scrap everything else, but I'd like to do this piece. That's what happened to me, right? I had to scrap almost everything about medicine to find hospice, but I used what I call the art of subtraction. I subtracted out everything I didn't like about work and then found the things, the beckonings, the inklings that I had an interest in. But then I had to build a life of purpose around it. So that's the second way. First way, life review. Second way, art of subtraction, looking at your job. What are some other ways? The joys of childhood. How many of us had things we loved in childhood that eventually we left behind? Usually at that point where we started thinking about career, when our parents said we're starting to grow up, when we started thinking that this is not something adults do, kids do. I love to give the example of, when you're 3 or 4 and you go to your parent and you say, I want to build a swimming pool in the backyard. Your mom or dad will take you to the backyard and you will play all day and you'll giggle your head off. If you went at the age of 12 and said the same thing to your parent, they would tell you how it couldn't be done, how there are, all sorts of ordinances, and maybe it's not the right type of ground, and who's going to let them in, and how are you going to pay for this? We tend to squash the dreams and hopes of our children, but usually there's some inkling of purpose there. What we love as kids sometimes stays with us for our whole lives. What populated your room as a child? What were the posters? What were the things you dug? What did you win trophies for? Sometimes those can be the purpose anchors that you start building or creating purpose around as an adult. And so there are the few ways to start thinking about what looks like purpose in your mind. I love the late night awakenings. Like, when was the last time you woke up in the middle of the night with a crazy idea and it started going around in your head and you couldn't fall back asleep? And it kept you up all night, and then the next day you're exhausted and you go to work and you convince yourself that that was some crazy idea and you forget about it, never think about it again. Some of those are actually the whisperings of something that could be real purposeful for you. Often I tell people, if you have no idea, ask your family and friends. When do they see you most lit up and having the most joy? Sometimes you don't even recognize it, but they know. Now remember, your family members have their other wants and needs regarding you, and so they sometimes don't give you the best information. So if they tell you to do something that doesn't feel good, then you probably don't want to do it. But sometimes your loved ones actually know more about what looks like purpose to you than you know. And last but not least, there's my favorite, which I call the spaghetti method. If you have no idea what purpose looks like in your life, throw a bunch of crap against the wall and see what skips. Say yes to people you normally don't say yes to. Do things you normally wouldn't do or that even scare you. Try new things, and if you find some joy in the process, not in the goal, not in what you achieved, but if you find some joy in the process, do those things. Now, as we sit here, I know that a number of you are saying, okay, fine. Little P purpose, big P purpose, find those anchors, but isn't that kind of selfish? I mean, are we meant to just do what we want in life to make ourselves happy? What about impact? What about legacy? How am I going to change the world? Well, let me tell you a story. It's a story about my maternal grandfather who I never met. My maternal grandfather in the 1950s had a love affair with math. He loved math. He loved it so much he became a CPA. And when my mom was little, she would sit on his lap, and this is in the 1950s, no computers, no QuickBooks, none of that. He had a big spreadsheet, and she would sit on his lap, and he would explain what every box meant, and he'd fill them in. And she got to see his pure joy in math, his, what I like to call, little P purpose, not goal-oriented, based on process. It was him doing the thing that lit him up. And so my mom did what all kids do. She saw this identity in her father, she saw the sense of purpose, and she tried it on. Because that's what kids do. They try on what you model for them and decide, does it work for them or doesn't? And you know what? It worked for her. And she decided she loved math. And my mom became a CPA. When I was a little kid, I had a learning disability. I couldn't read. My friends were all reading, and they took me and gave me coloring books. But I was really good at math. Because I had tried on my mom's identity, and I loved math. And probably the one thing that convinced me that I wasn't stupid and I was going to be okay was the fact that I was better at math than reading. The fact that I could hang with the smartest people in the math class. And you know what? I became a doctor, which is a highly mathematical field. And then, one day, right after I started practicing, I was walking around the hospital seeing a patient of mine, and he kept on getting admitted over and over and over again on the cusp of death, dehydrated. And I looked at his lab tests, and something in my brain clicked, and I saw a mathematical connection between two of his blood tests. And eventually I used that to diagnose him with a rare disease that, strangely enough, a simple medication helped him. He stopped coming into the hospital. He stopped being dehydrated. It saved his life. And you know what his name was? Rabbi Simon. And Rabbi Simon, who happened to take in runaway kids, went back to his synagogue and continued doing the work he did, and he saved Chris's life. And 60 years after my grandfather passed, the effect on the world from his love of math, his little Pea Purpose, is still out there today. Like a stone dropped in the ocean, the water displaced, moved miles. It joined with other waves to get bigger at times and then dissipated. And it ended up coming up on the shore hundreds of miles away in different places and changed the world. My hope for you with this talk is to help you pursue little Pea Purpose. My hope is you'll use that little Pea Purpose to connect with other people, to become teacher and student, to become mentor and mentee. My hope is that you use your gifts to change the world. My hope is that, like my grandfather, years and years after you've passed, your legacy and impact will endure. As a side note, my grandfather's name was Morris Adler. He died 60 years ago. He died in the 1960s. I was born in 1973.